Hello, I'm Kuljit Bhamra. The tabla is a beautiful sounding drum. It's a percussive instrument, but it has a wide range of tones that are soft, gentle, resonant, and melodious. If you play the tabla mostly by hitting on the black spots to create short, sharp sounds, the tabla can also sound somewhat aggressive and perhaps menacing. Over the years of having done hundreds of workshops around the world, I made it a point of asking people what they think the tabla sounds like to them. And generally speaking, young children hear the tabla for the first time, and their most two common answers are, it sounds like a butterfly, and secondly, it sounds like a raindrop or water. Adults, on the other hand, tend to say something like the tabla sounds soothing, calming, or meditative. In this tutorial, I'll be explaining how to write for tabla and how to create a tabla score so that you as a composer can convey precisely to the player what you'd like in your composition or song. Before we start the tutorial, I'd like to say a couple of things. Firstly, the idea of actually notating tabla in a way that is universally understood is a very new concept. I first realized the need for a tabla notation in 2002 when I was in an Andrew Lloyd Webber show in the West End called Bombay Dreams. And I'd never been in a show before. And in fact, when I was first booked to play in the show, I thought it was just one show. And it very soon dawned upon me that it was a run, you know. So that was a new thing for me to start off with. And then it dawned upon me very soon after that there had to be a way of me writing my tabla notation down so that when I took time off from the show, or if I was ill for any reason, my deputy could step in and play exactly what I had been playing. And since then, I've been developing the tabla notation in association with three organisations, namely the Purcell School of Music, Exeter University, and also the organisation known as Sound and Music. And it has been used now for over 10 years in classical pieces, and it was also more recently used in another show in the West End called Bend It Like Beckham, which was the stage adaptation of the film Bend It Like Beckham, with a score by Howard Goodall. And in that show, the tabla notation was used to its full capacity, not only for tabla, but also for the doll drum. As you may know already, the traditional method of conveying rhythm patterns and sounds is done through an oral system of verbalized syllables or mnemonics known as bol. And bol literally in Indian languages means to speak. Syllables, patterns, and phrases are memorized as part of the tabla player's training program. So obviously, one of the disadvantages of that system is you need a good memory. And secondly, another disadvantage is you need a very good Indian pronunciation. I think it's important to say that in the traditional setting, the need for writing down a notation system is not there because the emphasis is mostly on improvising rather than reading a third-party composition. There are some schools of tabla and some teachers who have taken the time to write down their oral repertoire. But in my experience of examining those documents, they seem mostly to me a bit like an in-house memory jogger, so to speak. And those documents generally are not understood by other schools or other teachers, and certainly they are not understood by other cultures around the world. They're a sort of shorthand way of documenting the repertoire that's been passed down from generation to generation. I don't want to over-labour my point, but one of the things that happens to me quite often is when I go shopping, and I'll pull out my shopping list from my pocket, which is a list that I've jotted down at home in a sort of shorthand. And one thing that always happens to me is there's always 2 or 3 items on the list that I just can't read, even though I've written the list myself. So that's one of the sort of shortfalls of writing or having your own system which is exclusive to yourself. I mean, I can't read my list, let alone someone else being able to read it. But anyway, I've made my point. Another important thing to say is the traditional system is very well designed if you're someone who wants to perform as a soloist or an accompanist tabla player alongside a soloist such as a sitar player or a vocalist or a flute player. It's probably not designed for a tabla player with a Western string quartet or with a Western jazz quintet, for example. So that's another shortfall of the traditional system. From a composer's point of view, it's definitely useful to have some prior basic knowledge about the existing patterns that are known in the tabla community. And if that is something that does interest you, then what I suggest you do is get hold of my book, Read and Play Tabla, Module 3. I'll put it up on the screen right now. And in that book, I have notated the common rhythmical patterns used by tabla players. And there's no reason why you can't lift those patterns out and use it as a starting point or building block for your own composition or song. Okay, so without any further ado, let's look at how to write for tabla. I've divided the tutorial into 3 segments. In the first segment, we will look at the instrument itself and what sounds it can produce. In segment number 2, we will look at actually how to notate those sounds. And in segment 3, I'll be presenting some tips, some do's and some don'ts, and some ideas of how to really get the best out of the tabla, given the scope of the drum and also the scope of a human being's hands. Okay, so here we go. Okay, so the very first thing to say, which also may sound very silly to many of you, and that is, when you are specifying tabla in your composition, make sure you say Indian tabla. Now, this is also a tabla or tabla. This is an Egyptian tabla, and it is very different to the Indian tabla, as you can see. What you don't want is to write for tabla and have the wrong instrument specified, or what's happened to me in the past is you have the wrong musician turn up for the session. So that's the first thing. Okay, so what is the Indian tabla? Well, the Indian tabla is a 2-piece drum set, and generally speaking, you have a larger metal drum and you have a smaller wooden drum. So the wooden drum is of a smaller diameter and has more tension in the straps. So that enables it to produce a higher sound as opposed to the lower drum, which produces a lower sound. The most distinguishing features of the tabla are the black spots in the middle. And these are carbon paste, a mixture of carbon paste that's applied during the making of the drum. And it's these spots that allow the drum to resonate more than a normal bongo would, for example. So if I strike the drum very gently, you can hear it resonating, as opposed to a standard bongo, which I have here. If I was to strike that, that's the length and or duration of the resonance. The other thing about the black spots is also that it enables the lower drum to make this beautiful and very iconic sound of the tabla. And it's the weight of the paste on that drum head that enables that. Because the drum's still resonating, it gives me the option of applying an after effect or a glissando to that note. Whereas on the smaller bongo, I couldn't do that. There's sort of nothing to ride on, so to speak. Okay, the other important thing to say is the tabla is a hand drum. And if you're a composer that's passionate about extended techniques, I would definitely advise not playing these with sticks. The sticks will damage the paste, and whenever I visit classrooms in schools that have tablas in stock, they are usually damaged by students hitting the drums with a drumstick. Even a soft beater, I think, would damage the skin. So make sure it is just only played by hand. Another amazing feature of the tabla drum is because of these black spots, it enables the tabla to have two open sounds as opposed to one open sound. Most drums have only one type of open sound and one type of closed sound. With the tabla, it has two open sounds, a fully resonant one on the edge, and then a closed sound. Fully open, a sort of half muted open, which is the most common strike, and then a closed sound. The fascinating thing about the open sound on the smaller drum, which is the one that's tuned, and we'll talk about that later on, is that it ends up having two pitches. So, la, 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 la. That's actually in a lower register, but I'm not a great singer, as you can tell. Cool. So that's the scope of the tabla sound world, and then the tabla is played with hands. So there is a beauty of that, and there's also a limitation with that, and we will talk about that when we get to the notation. Let's now look at how to notate those sounds in a tabla score. Okay, so this is going to look surprisingly simple to you if you're somebody who is trained in Western notation. And what we're going to use for the tabla, because it is a sort of elaborate bongo drum, is an adaptation of a simple two-line bongo stave. The lower drum is the bottom line, the higher sounding drum, or the smaller drum, is the top line. Open notes and closed notes are denoted by a solid note head or a cross note head. The position of the note head above the line or below the line denotes where the strike is made. So if I was to strike the tabla in the middle and make the fully resonant sound, that is a solid note head, but it also has a harmonic circle at the top to show that it is a completely open sound. If I was to strike extremely on the edge, then that would be above the line. And coming in slightly towards the center, but with my third finger still sort of muting the skin, that note head will be below the line. And that's more like a muted version of the first one. Let me play them together. There is very little difference between those two notes. If you're standing 20 feet away, you may not hear the difference, but there is a difference. And more importantly, I think for the player, it is the sort of ghost or the shadow side of the first note. So rather than doing Cool. So those are the three open notes of the smaller drum. This one's called na. That's ta and tu. The close sound is made by striking the black spots and holding your fingers down to keep the sound dead. And there are two ways of doing this. And the reason for that is with tabla playing, the dominant hand, which plays the smaller drum, is divided into two limbs, so to speak. So by creating a division between my middle finger and my forefinger, or my index finger, I can somehow create two limbs, which gives me extra speed. So rather than going like this, which I think is the fastest I can do right now, I could do this. Adding the left closed hand, which this one actually normally on the closed sound acts as one limb as opposed to this being two. And adding this, you can see how a fast roll can be created. So on the lower drum, or the larger drum as I call it in the notation book, there is an open sound, fully open, which again is a solid note head under the line with a harmonic circle. There is a half muted sound in which your heel rests gently on the skin, and that's above the line, a solid note head above the line. And then there's a close sound, which again is a cross note head on the line. And these sounds are called ga, g, and k, respectively. The glissando, which many people love, and quite rightly so, I think, is created by striking the lower drum and moving your heel across the skin after you've struck it. So strike, or it could be the g strike and then the slide. And there are three types of slides. There's a slide followed by a strike. There is a strike followed by a slide and then no strike after that. And then there is a slide within the note, so to speak. And you can see on the screen how the three of these are notated. So here are some tips and some ideas for best using the tabla sound. Tabla is used very well in ostinato patterns or patterns which are repeated, because obviously that fits in with a sort of tabla way of thinking of having a cyclic pattern or a journey, and you can then improvise around that. I'm going to start off by speaking about an obvious feature of the drum, and that is that there are two of them. Why are there two drums? Yeah, one's a low sounding drum and one's a high sounding drum, but why do you need a low sounding drum? Why just not have a high sounding drum? Yes, it adds another sound, a low sounding drum, but the purpose, or one of the purposes of having a lower drum, is to create a natural accent. So if I play a pattern, a sort of 6/8 pattern on the right hand drum only, the smaller drum, you may not know where the downbeat is until I do this. So given that the tabla is a soft instrument and it doesn't have a huge dynamic range like a marimba or a bass drum, for example, the lower sounding drum is used very effectively to create a downbeat, which is usually an accented beat, or to create an accent in the middle of a cycle. As you may have noticed there, I also use the glissando as an upbeat. And in Indian traditional rhythms, it's very common that that happens. So it really is a bit like a and now, 2, 3, and now, 2, 3. One of the questions that I'm asked frequently is, can you slide backwards? Now, the answer to that is no, because by the time your hand has reached the sort of center of the drum, there's no sound to slide back on. I couldn't do that because I'm already muting it. So even though in theory it sounds like an interesting idea, it's not possible to slide backwards. What is possible is to adjust the pressure of the heel of your hand to create a sort of pitch deflection or range. So if I did this, so that's a useful thing to know about, although you can't really, although each one of those sounds that I played does have a pitch, it's not a reliable pitch. The lower drum is tuned very loosely, and it's affected, both drums actually are affected by humidity and moisture and temperature, and the lower drum is definitely affected by that because it's metal. Temperature changes and humidity changes seem to affect it more. So I couldn't really play defined notes on that, although relatively speaking it is a bit like a sort of broomstick bass line, if you know what that is. A very important feature of notating tabla is to really be aware of what I spoke about before, that the hands are divided into a 2 and a 1. So when doing rolls or fast passages, they normally end up being written as a sort of triplet, but they're not triplets. But when I say triplet, I mean in a sort of 3 mode. So when you're writing a series of closed sounds using cross note heads, the best way of doing it is to have 1, 2 on the smaller drum, which is the top line, 1 strike on the lower line, and then continue again with that pattern. And of course, again, you can choose where to put your accent. So it could be on the first beat, or it could be but wherever you wanted it to be. Naturally, from a sort of human body perspective, the first strike is made up of 3 fingers. So it tends to have a slightly louder sound to it compared to the one with the index finger. I'll just play it now to demonstrate to you. There is a very subtle difference, and perhaps some traditional tabla players may not like the idea of having the same notation for both. If you're sitting close to the tabla like I am, I can certainly feel a difference between the two. But I think once you get to 2 or 3 feet away, you probably don't hear the difference. And also, if you do hear a difference, I think the question to ask is, from a functionality point of view, does that difference matter? It's a closed sound. So whether that's played like that or like that is arguably a conversation to have at another point, but I don't think it makes a lot of difference. So in my notation system, these are notated the same way as a cross note head on the top line. But just coming back to my point about writing rolls and fast passages of close sounds in succession, then the best way to do that, I think, is to always have it with 2 on the top line, 1 on the bottom line, and 2 on the top line again. You don't need to start with the top line. You could also start with the bottom line if you wanted to. But once you're in that roll, then try and keep to that 2-1 formation. rolls don't necessarily need to be rhythmical. Of course, if you're playing a pattern and you want to include a slow roll into that pattern, then of course it's rhythmical. For example, that's obviously a rhythmical pattern made up of open and closed sounds. But if you wanted a sort of tremolo, there's no reason why you can't notate that as you would normally with the stem and the cross hatches to show that you want a tremolo. Sometimes I even put a line across the length of the tremolo or roll required, because in that instant rhythm is not important. It's more about the texture of the sound that you're looking for as a composer. If you're writing a tabla score and you know that the performer will be a traditional Indian tabla player, there is no reason, if you've got a repeated pattern or cyclic pattern that you wanted that person to improvise around, there's no reason why you couldn't say in your score, improvise around this pattern, but maybe keep the accents the same. Tabla players are experts of doing that, as I mentioned earlier on before the tutorial. So there's no reason why you can't do that. But again, I think it's important to clarify or be very clear about what you want the performer to do. So sometimes when I perform, people write improvise around this pattern with only open sounds, or perhaps with only closed sounds. And you can be more specific about what you want for those particular areas of your composition. So let's talk about tuning. Now, tablas obviously have a very distinct pitch, but they fall under the category of unpitched percussion. You could argue that a bongo drum is also tuned. If I was to play this, that is a note. No. It's probably a note that, I don't know how to say this, but it's probably a note that doesn't matter, so to speak, in the genre of music that it's performed in. But the moment I do this, it then becomes musical in a way. Has definitely got an interval or something about it. Nevertheless, these are short sounds, and in the genres of music that they are played regularly, they don't affect the chordal progression or the melodic side of things, and they're not designed to do that anyway. Whereas, because a tabla has a resonant sound, it has to be tuned to a particular pitch. And it also, as a composer, you need to bear in mind the pitch of the drum. Now, what happens in traditional Indian music is that the tabla is tuned, this tabla, the smaller drum, is tuned to a particular pitch, and that is normally the tonic of the raga that's being performed. So if the raga is performed in C sharp or C, the tabla player would tune this tabla to that note. Now, I'm not sure what that is at the moment, but I think it is probably a C or something like that. And what happens is the tabla player would tune his or her drum using a hammer. And I'm not going to go into how to tune the tabla at the moment because it can be a bit laborious. But by knocking these chocks up and down and adjusting the plat, a tabla can be tuned to a particular note. There are tablas for different notes. This one couldn't go down an octave, for example. It just wouldn't sound at all, probably. So each tabla has its own preferred range of sounds. If I wanted a really low-sounding tabla, I would go for a larger diameter. And as a composer, if you wanted a tabla tuned to A3, for example, then as a tabla player, I would bring one of those tablas along rather than just turn up with one that normally sounds good in a higher register. So it's important to specify what tuning you'd like in your tabla. One thing that Indian musicians haven't really harnessed, in my opinion, is the feature that I spoke about earlier on, which is when you play a fully open note, which is the note head with the circle above it or below it, that has a different pitch. So if I tuned my tabla to a C, let's assume that's a C, this note will be a D. In the lower register. So when I watch Indian classical recitals and the tabla player is doing a lot of that in a C-based rag, it does, I have to say, grate with me slightly. And although it's a lovely sound, it doesn't always work musically. And I have to say, I do think many tabla players are unaware of that feature. I think many people think that I've tuned my tabla to C and I'm playing a C. No, but that's a D, by the way. Anyway, I won't go on about that too much. So here's another thing. As a composer, if the C, for example, doesn't work in a part of your composition, there's no reason why you couldn't restrict the sounds to close sounds there. There's also no reason why you couldn't modulate and ask the tabla player to move to another small drum. So sometimes when I perform with Western musicians, let's call them Western musicians, even though I consider myself Western now as well. But when I work in a Western genre and there's a modulation or there's a key change, sometimes I have another maybe one or two tablas to the side of me, smaller tablas, that I then can move to. But obviously, as a composer, when you're writing for tabla, you need to allow time for the tabla player to move to that. It does take that amount of time. What I would do is notate it just above, just put a text notation above the stave to say go to tabla D or go to tabla F, and make sure you're clear about that. But there's no reason why you can't do that. Okay, so that's the end of this video. I hope you've enjoyed watching it, and I do hope it's been useful to you. As I said before, if you have any questions, then please go to the website of my company, which is Kada Music, and I'll put the address on the screen here. There are lots of resources and support material for you as a composer on that site. And again, if you want to remember the notations for each sound, then just go to the strikes and sound page, and then there will be a chart there which will help you to remember the symbols for each of the notes. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for your interest and showing interest in this fairly new concept, I think, but I think it is the future of tabla. There's no reason why tabla cannot be performed in an orchestra just like any other percussion instrument. See you soon. Thank you.